So it's great to be here at the Micromobility Conference once again. My name is Laura Bliss. I'm a reporter at Bloomberg City Lab, which is a news outlet that covers all things kind of urban policy and politics. I cover transportation among many other things. And yeah, I'm really excited to get to facilitate this chat with Janette on the subject of car-free streets. And how they intersect with pandemic resiliency and kind of the post-pandemic urban world. I'll just give a little bit of introduction to what we're going to be talking about, and then to Janette herself, who may require no more introduction, but we will do it anyways. So car-free streets were really one of the defining urban design stories of this past year, with cities around the world taking advantage of traffic lulls during the early weeks of the pandemic to launch these temporary car-free or traffic-restricted streets programs, some of which have already become permanent. This is a trend that's been widely cheered by safety advocates, environmentalists, and certainly many of the micromobility fans in this audience, as a boom in bike sales drove home the value of streets ruled by pedestrians, cyclists, and people at play over the cars that had long kind of locked them up. But slow streets initiatives have also drawn some controversy as they hit a sore spot in a pretty sensitive moment this past year. The pandemic in the United States has claimed Black and brown lives at disproportionate rates. Outrage over police killings has ignited global protests. And slow streets actually became, at some points, a flashpoint in that kind of broader reckoning over systemic racism that was happening in the urban planning sphere. And those debates have really caused some rethinking in the transportation space and urban planning space, and even the kind of idea of what it means to reallocate street space fairly. So really no better person to reflect on the year that was as city streets took on these kind of new identities and purposes. Janette Sadik-Khan is one of the world's foremost authorities on transportation and urban transformation. As you heard, she served as New York City's transportation commissioner from 2007 to 2013 under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. She oversaw historic changes to the city's streets at that time, pedestrianizing Broadway and Times Square, building nearly 400 miles of bike lanes, 7 rapid bus lines, and creating more than 60 pedestrian plazas citywide. She's also a founding principal with Bloomberg Associates, where she works with mayors around the world to reimagine and redesign their cities. And she chairs the National Association of Transportation Officials, NACTO, and the Global Designing Cities Initiative, implementing new people-focused street design standards, which have been adopted in more than 150 cities across the US and around the world. Whew. So my first question for you, Janette, is kind of to like reflect on that the pedestrianization of New York, of Times Square, rather, 2009. It's been more than a decade since, and now we're seeing in this last year just this kind of slew of cities take pretty important steps in the direction of kind of pedestrianization and bike-friendly streets. What would you say was clear to you in 2009 that now seems to be so much more obvious to planners all over the country?
Well, first of all, Laura, great to be here with you. Great to be here with Oliver and all of you on the Micromobility Conference. It's such an important topic at such an important time. And thinking back 10 years ago when we were closing Times Square, people thought that, this was crazy, radical insanity stuff. I mean, we had major media people coming out and saying that we were creating a, petting zoo, and this was going to create Carmageddon. And you can't do that. Streets are not for people. Streets are for cars. Get it right, Missy. Streets are for cars. And so there was this huge, backlash about it, even practically before we started. And, after we pedestrianized Times Square, and I worked for a data-driven guy, Mike Bloomberg, who was all about let's see what happens. We'll measure it, and if it's a success, we'll keep it, and if not, we'll put it back. And so we measured what happened when we closed Times Square to cars and we opened it to people, and it worked much better from a transportation perspective. Greenhouse gas emissions went way down. It was much better for the local economy, and it was a much safer place. And so what ended up happening is, people, had predicted that it was going to be this nightmare, and it was this total home run. And it sort of changed people's expectations about what streets could be used for, and so we completely reimagined the crossroads of the world. And it was not the crossroads of congestion that it had been before, but we were really inviting people to enjoy the city. And that invitation to look at streets differently was a radical act 10 years ago. And now in many, many more cities, it's business as usual. And I think that's a huge sea change. Even the vocabulary for how we talk about our streets has changed.
It's almost like this Overton window shift. The vocabulary point is really interesting one, and I'd love to hear more on that. Like, which words are you hearing more of that were like totally radical vocabulary a decade ago?
Well, I mean, I think the Overton window is actually an interesting way to frame the conversation, and the way we looked at our streets changed. Also since last March, things that were cities thought were impossible in 2019 are now obvious, essential city actions in 2020. And of course, it's really hard to talk about opportunities, with 400,000 deaths and, 75 million jobless claims filed and 500 million jobs lost worldwide. So, business is shut down and many businesses are not going to reopen. But I think there's a real cause for optimism. And, we're seeing that with some of the vaccines and new leadership in Washington, which is going to be a really important lever. And so we've got the experience of 2020 under our belt. And so I think it's really, last year was the year of the street, and we're starting to see that. And I think you're seeing people become much more fluent in the language of, bus lanes and bike lanes and slow streets and neighborhood streets, and the kinds of things that weren't top of mind before are now much more part of the common vocabulary. And coming from the perspective of transportation, I think that one of the enduring images of COVID-19 era will be this global transformation of streets and public spaces. And it's interesting to me that one of the first things that mayors did was to open their streets, because people needed space to interact and to be outside of their home safely. And, restaurants and stores needed the room. And you had all these empty lanes, when cities shut down early in the pandemic, that were underutilized. And I think those empty lanes showed the outline of what we needed to build.
I'm really glad that you kind of made that transition, because I guess that's still sort of a question that I think is worth looking at, like why this was kind of the number one pandemic response by city officials. I mean, transportation officials specifically, but in some places, like one of the most prominent responses from cities across the board. I mean, there does seem to be kind of a tension there. Was it sort of this opportunity like seized, like, oh yeah, now the streets are clear, we can follow Janette and do the things we wanted to do for the last 5 years, or was there like a real demand from residents that we want space to jog and ride our bikes in the streets specifically?
Yeah, I think people were looking for safe, sustainable ways to get around. I mean, and the city shut down, but in some ways, we never really needed our streets more. Essential workers still needed to get, to their jobs, and people needed to get, shopping and supplies. So the thing that was really interesting, I think, was, that emptiness of the streets, showed that outline of what was possible. And so you saw a lot more of people looking opportunistically about their streets. And it wasn't just about fun and games. It wasn't just like playing in the street. It was about how do we create ways for people to get around easier, in this period of time? How do we get them outside safely when they're locked down? And you saw that in cities around the world. Like Milan did some amazing, first rung work, creating 22 miles of pedestrian and bikeable streets. And, you saw Paris, Mayor Hidalgo, just incredible work, made the Rue de Rivoli, which goes through the heart of Paris, car-free, and is building 400 miles of bike lanes, and is starting to make this all permanent. And you saw this in London and Bogota, and you saw it in the United States. You saw cities like Seattle, Mayor Durkin putting 20 miles down, and and Oakland and Chicago and Denver, dozens of American cities pedestrianizing their streets. And so I think it was really, it was this moment where you were actually able to take your 2030 plan maybe and have it be your 2020 plan. We needed to do these kinds of interventions all along, but this provided a way to do it. And I think, the winners of this, post-vaccine era are going to be those cities that can adapt to the new realities without going back to the status quo and, not going back to where they were last February. So I think it's important that we plan for a future that we want to see, which is and not just cross our fingers and hope for the best. We need to probably look at a mix of in-person work and work from home. But I think I do think it's this moment that we've got, and the pandemic really revealed the streets that we've always needed.
I think it's the point about, kind of skipping forward to the 2030 plan in 2020. You're so right. I think that the kind of moment of the pandemic and the emptiness of the streets were also this chance to kind of skip over what might have otherwise been very long drawn out community engagement processes in some places. And I think Oakland most prominently, right, there was really some pushback against that because in some neighborhoods where essential workers were still traveling and, the streets were not necessarily totally empty, this was not seen as, a thoughtful response. It was kind of a tone deaf response because people were still commuting and people needed, safe street crossings at actually very different intersections, parts of the kind of streetscape. And so there was this kind of flashpoint, as I said earlier, especially in the ways that kind of disconnect resonated with earlier missteps by urban planners in ways that intersected with race. And so I'm wondering, in your position at NACTO, give us a little insight into what, the conversations among city planners have been in light of some of that pushback and kind of what's been learned. Is the kind of slow streets model a one size fits all solution?
It's a great question, and it's a really important topic. And one size doesn't fit all. And like Corinne said in your City Lab piece a couple of weeks ago, the speed is the same as the speed of implementation. And cities like Seattle and Oakland saw some pushback to open streets. And but this isn't entirely new. This is a reality and something that DOTs have to consider in their everyday practices. The process is the project, and people need to be included, not just advised and informed. And you saw a wide variety of reactions. Some neighborhoods criticized mayors and DOTs for not moving fast enough, to create and expand open streets programs. And there were other communities that were astonished, that a DOT that took forever to build a crosswalk, or a sidewalk, suddenly designated their street a shared street overnight, and I think that's really more of a symptom of long-term disengagement. And the lesson isn't to do nothing, but it's to start by engaging and listening and communicating and understanding. And when you pull back and look at it, you have to remember that even when times are good health and prosperity, not everybody in every neighborhood wants all the same things, and there isn't unanimity. I remember when I gave a talk in Toronto one time, talking about the bike lanes that we were putting in, and this gentleman stood up and said, "How did you get unanimous consent behind your bike lanes?" I was like, "There's no unanimous consent in bike lanes. That's not how it works." And in New York City, people ran right over the barriers and moved them off the streets, and neighbors fought over them. So, in some senses, the street fight never went away. And there's, that's always been true. And it's, no less true during the pandemic. But one of the things that we found in New York City is that it's so important to educate communities on on what your transportation departments can do for you. And it's important to have an opt-in mechanism. When we were done showing what was possible with our different programs, we created all of these programs became opt-in programs. You could opt in for a plaza, you could opt in for a bike rally, you could opt opt in for bike lanes. And so, that's a similar situation in terms of New York City. You saw those, it was successful because you had neighborhoods and neighbors that were actually local volunteers moving the barriers into place. And so that was the only way it could actually happen. And I think, it's really the blueprint for what streets can look like in 2021.
Do you feel like there are standout examples, within your NACTO sort of sphere of colleagues that really show how to do it, sort of balance that sense of urgency and like we need to make these significant changes now for the post-pandemic climate future, and the kind of conversations and like trust building and stuff that you were speaking to?
Yes, absolutely. I chair NACTO, as you mentioned, and we teamed up with Bloomberg Philanthropies to give $25,000 grants to 10 cities to support community-generated projects to respond to the pandemic, and it included open streets, mobility hubs, and outdoor restaurants, and Black and brown neighborhoods in Philly and Portland, and broadband outreach. But a really big piece of this was the community conversations that needed to go along with this in the community involvement process. And a lot of DOTs were, frankly, worried about how to move fast, but to move fast with, community buy-in. And so this guide, which you can find on NACTO's website, nacto.org, goes through those 10 case studies and what cities have learned. And I can't say enough for Tamika Butler, who was a counselor on this grant program, and is really gone a long way to helping cities have that kind of vocabulary and what they need to do to have really effective community involvement. Because to put a finer point on it, transportation policy is environmental policy, and it's economic policy, and it's equity policy. And what we do on our streets has a direct impact on the opportunities and the livelihoods for millions of people. And so the way we get there is important, and it's worth it for communities and for government agencies and for everyone. And so it's a very important time. It's a very important piece of work for all of us to be focused on, not only today, but going forward.
Yeah, it's such an interesting lens to look at, which neighborhoods feel like they have a trusted partner in the city government, which neighborhoods feel like they've just been ignored basically for decades. This slow streets concept specifically, because it is so much about the kind of local use and local needs and desires for the street. So it really seems like something that pretty much all cities learned. It seems like it's been like a true pilot kind of program in that sense, that every city has learned something from. I wanted to ask about some of the other kind of urban planning and street design models that really became more prominent in this last year. I think one of the big ones is this 15-minute city concept, which definitely has some important overlaps with the slow streets and kind of street pedestrianization and bike lanefication kind of vision. So it's something that we've seen really take off in reality, like in poured concrete reality in Paris in particular.
Oh yeah.
A popular concept discussed by planners in the United States, where cities really don't resemble Paris at all. So, what do you kind of make of the 15-minute concept, which is to say, everything within 15 minutes, whether it's your job or grocery shopping or, whatever it may be on bike or foot or transit trip? Is it this kind of buzzword to describe something that has been around for quite a long time, or is there something useful or new in this concept for how it could kind of lead cities into the future?
Well, it's definitely buzzy. You've got mayoral candidates running on it. So, like in New York City, we have a mayoral candidate that's already said, I'm all about the 15-minute city, and I do think that there are people that are like, what? What's a 15-minute city? And a lot of cities were built during the car boom of the 20th century, and most reflect these kind of outdated design standards. And so, you had a system where, because people were driving, planners designed cities, so that you work here and you play here and you eat here and you exercise there. And, after a while, you needed a car to get everywhere. And people stopped investing entirely in any other way of getting around. And so it's so interesting because you think after a century of building these roads, we should we should be all fine. Traffic should be going just fine. And of course, it's only getting worse and it's threatening the planet. And so I really think that the smart mobility innovation of this century is not going to be using tech, to reduce traffic congestion. It's going to be building a city where you don't need to drive in the first place. And I think the concept of a 15-minute city is a blueprint for that kind of city, recreating that kind of ancient way of getting around, where people live and work and go to school and play in an area where you can reach everything within 15 minutes, whether by walking or biking or transit. And I think what's interesting is it sounds very familiar now, because in a lot of cities, the urban radius of what we do in our daily life has really gotten a lot smaller. We're kind of in, because we're not going out as much and commuting to work as much. And a lot of people didn't even really go beyond a 5 to 10 minute, radius for shopping and schools and supplies. In a way, they're kind of already unconsciously operating on this 15-minute city idea. And it's great, if you've got these walkable neighborhoods. It's better for the local economy, it's better for health, it's better for seniors, it's better for kids who can walk to school, it's better for equity and opportunity when you can get to places and where the location just doesn't, it doesn't define you. But to get to the city you want, you have to start with the city you have. And it gets to your point that like not everybody's got that, is structured that same way. The 15-minute city doesn't spring up overnight. You have to create it, and you have to start where your opportunities are and look at where people are traveling to and look at how you can get those destinations to work together. So, a lot of cities like Nashville or Houston or Salt Lake City, or even LA, you practically need a car just across the street, but I think there's a real opportunity to look at creating clusters as destinations, kind of like walkable microclimates, where you can, drive and park, and then the rest of your trips can be done by foot or on by bike. But a lot of neighborhoods, as you've written, Laura, in a lot of places, walkable neighborhoods are actually illegal. Zoning rules prohibit, a lot of that kind of design, and many of those rules have origins in structural racism. And so, but, the city of self-sufficient communities, which has everything you need, and a better daily life where your neighbors and your merchants, it's just a more equal and more accessible city to live in.
Right. If you live in that neighborhood, if that's the truly sort of equitable 15-minute city utopia. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking, like about, you have to start with the city you have. There are also in other parts of the world, we've been focusing a lot on the US, but in parts of the Middle East and in Asia, sort of an extension of the kind of build from the ground up smart city. There's kind of a 15-minute-y city flavor to some of the new kind of city building projects that we're seeing in other parts of the world. And I know that your work, takes you to projects all over the place. And so, is there sort of a temptation out there to not start with the city that you have, but kind of try to do it from scratch in a way that's laid out in this more, 15-minute accessible manner?
I think it's an idea and it's an organizing principle. And I think, whether it's for something new or looking at how you are working to provide a more walkable strategy for your city in different types of densities and sizes, it's that idea, which is, I think, a powerful one, looking at how you can get around without having to have a car. And it's been really interesting to see places like, we've done some work in Detroit under Mayor Duggan, and, looking at moving from having 10% of your residents be within a 15-minute walk of high capacity transit to 70% being within a 15-minute walk of high capacity transit by redesigning your local bus system. So there's lots of different ways and there are lots of different levers to look at this. And, again, some of this is going to require updating zoning in many cities, and some of it is just reimagining and reorganizing, the assets that you have now to accomplish those ends. I think it's really interesting. Transportation, so much of the time, there's no vision about the outcome that you're trying to achieve. We've certainly seen that in the national, program, right? Our vision at the national US DOT level has been like, building the interstate highway system, right? Well, check, we built the interstate highway system. I think we can move on and do something else right now. And I think it's very exciting to see a new vision come to the forefront that's very much reflective of that. A secretary that's talking about Vision Zero, a secretary that looks at streets as more than moving cars, an FHWA administrator that talks about car-free cities, that wrote a design book on transit, wrote a design book on walkability. Like, this is going to be a new road order and a new era, I think, not only nationally, but make it a lot easier to do things locally with a kind of permission slip at the federal level.
I want to definitely return to that, but I also want to give some time to the subject of this conference and sort of how micromobility fits into what we're talking about here. We saw bike sales, more than double in the United States last year. And I think Oliver was sharing a really amazing statistic that I hadn't heard, that the Netherlands sold more e-bikes than cars. So there's some really interesting shifts happening in the bike space specifically. Also, for the shared mobility providers and businesses that definitely struggled this past year. But I'm interested. I mean, what do you make of some of those trends, and how do you envision them fitting into the post-pandemic kind of street landscape?
I'm just about to run out of juice on my computer.
Uh-oh. Oh no.
Okay, so I think we got to plug over there. That's so funny. Well, 2020 was supposed to be the year, I think, of micromobility. Tech was going to save the transportation world. You remember that? For like the last 5 years, we've been talking about, driverless cars and electric cars and flying cars and, but technology didn't really come to the rescue in 2020. It was really active mobility and transit that came to the rescue. And a lot of the action of e-scooter companies was to pull out, and Uber and Lyft scaled back their services and laid off thousands of people. And of course, I'm pulling for them to come back. They have a lot to offer for connecting people to transit, for making short trips possible, and decreasing the footprint of cars in cities. But the fundamentals haven't changed in the last year. The important thing isn't the technology as much as what the technology makes possible. The point isn't to have, cooler or smarter cars or bikes or scooters. It's to have better cities. And I think we need to rethink what transportation infrastructure means, and update the hardware of our streets, that physical bus lanes and bike lanes and better pedestrian, sidewalks and crosswalks and bike lanes, and update also the software on our streets. And I've talked about this before, using technology to have our streets work more efficiently with some of the on-demand and micromobility services. And I think that e-scooters and e-bikes are a great fit in that picture. There's no doubt. But they aren't the criteria of a great city. The quality of the street is. And we can't take our eye off the ball and leave the street as it is. And I think there's a real danger that we could just drive into the same dead end as we did, in the last century, because, a car is still a car, is still a car, whether it's an Uber or an autonomous car or an e-car. And cars don't just consume energy, they also, consume space. So if we just replace, private cars with AVs or e-cars, we've just changed the kind of car that we've got. And, if people don't mind riding in a driverless car for 2 hours, people are just going to move deeper into the exurbs. And so we really can't escape it by just building smarter, cleaner cars. That's just going to reinforce the devastating development patterns that's already gutted our cities. So I think that, again, lots of potential, and we see the great roles that micromobility can play. But it was really interesting to see that when the chips were down in 2020 and 2021, what came to the rescue?
Yeah, it's a really great framing. I mean, transit was part of that rescue, flotilla, as you just said, and yet transit is also, I mean, facing really, really challenging headwinds, right, to say the least. I mean, ridership is still down, 70% at least, I think, in New York City, and even more than that in other cities around the country. And, there's some stimulus in this latest package. There's a lot of hope that the Biden administration will deliver more, but it's still really unclear, obviously, when those riders are coming back and kind of what that means for the foundational, business model of transit. And to kind of connect it to the micromobility world, like that was always kind of talked about, public transit, friend not foe. Like that was kind of supposed to be the spine, right, on which all of these other kind of services and systems connected. And so, I mean, what do you sort of make of a city landscape where transit is, long-term diminished, but these other services are trying to kind of, I guess, fill in the gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different stories on the bike front and the transit front. I mean, the headline that we saw most of last year was how, ridership was down, how low it was, on U.S. systems, 80% nationwide, 90% where you are, in San Francisco, 80% in Seattle, 70% where I am in New York City, but being 70% below normal in New York City is still 1.7 million trips a day, right? And it just tells you how important our transit system is, to your point, that so many people still take it because they didn't have an option. And essential workers still needed to get to their jobs in hospitals, and workers had to get to warehouses and grocery stores. And, so the food chain, continued to work while we were all, working from home. And if transit wasn't there to take people to their jobs, the economic impact of the pandemic would have been much, much worse. And so, I don't think that the question is whether people are going to feel safe to ride transit again or whether transit's not going to come back. I mean, I wrote an article with my colleague Seth Solomano on how, despite fears, there were no traceable COVID clusters, on transit. And I don't really think that the low ridership now is a reflection of the perceived safety of buses and trains as much as it is a reflection of the economy. Transit ridership is an economic indicator, and people are not going to take transit until there are safe places to travel to. And when offices and classrooms and public spaces and retailers reopen. And so, in Washington, I think we need to go all in, not just to make transit whole, but to invest in its long-term stability and expansion. I was really interested in the fact that, U.S. transit agencies carry 10 times the amount of passengers that airlines do on every day. And U.S. transit agencies carry 10 times more than all of the airlines combined. But transit agencies got less than the airlines did, when it came to the relief package. And, that's just backwards, and we need to have an investment that reflects the transportation realities that we face today, because a worst case scenario in all of this, and I know you've written about this, is if we add a traffic and transportation crisis to the ongoing health and economic crisis, because cities are not going to recover if people can't get to jobs and opportunities. And, we've got unemployment at its highest level since the Depression. And getting people back to work depends on having them have, options for getting there.
So this new road order, to go back to what the new Biden administration signals to you, or the sort of potential of it, we've seen a number of new hires, new appointees to US DOT come straight from city departments of transportation, as you were alluding to, several of them, your NACTO colleagues. Say more about what those moves signal to you, and kind of what your hopes and expectations are for the next 4 years.
Well, I think it's really exciting. I mean, we have, Polly Trottenberg from New York City is going to be the deputy secretary. We've got women that are going to be running federal highway, federal transit, safety policy, and running communications, federal motor carrier. I mean, really running the gamut of US DOT. And what's really great about that, and a secretary that stated that he really believes in Vision Zero and looking at a multimodal strategy for the country. He had one of the best presidential platforms on transportation. And I know that because I was working on Mike Bloomberg's campaign, and we were sort of neck and neck on that. But it was a great investment strategy. And I think the idea of having a mayor be at the helm of USDOT is extremely important because they understand what cities need. And it's not just about good policy. They understand the budget impacts. They understand the reality of what it takes to deliver transportation investments on the ground. They know what it really means. And we've got people like Polly and Mira and Robin who have run agencies and managed politics and budget and programs. And so it's not a theoretical exercise. They know how to get it done. And transportation is a key part of the national recovery effort. And, Congress is working on Biden's rescue plan, $20 billion for transit, and more for infrastructure. And the secretary designee, Pete Buttigieg, wasn't exaggerating when he said this is a generational moment for infrastructure and a chance for us to redo the wrongs of our investment strategy over the last century. So it's really important that transportation recovery aid in 2021 can't and won't be the same old, money going to the same old projects. We have to change the projects that we're funding and the way that we're funding them so that we bring back projects and build projects smarter, faster, safer, greener. And on a policy level, that means, emergency funding for transit agencies, and it means a multimodal approach to transportation instead of investments that are just about cars and highways. We need to be investing in walking and biking and safety for everyone, and changing the design standards, turn the page on car-focused streets that we've spent most of the last century building. And we really need to invest in cities. 50% of the nation's GDP is generated by the top 25 cities and regions. And so we need to be providing direct aid to cities instead of giving it to states to trickle down. I could go on and on about what we need to do, but it's exciting to see an administration that gets it.
Thank you so much, Janette. This was just a great conversation. Any closing remarks you want to make for the audience?
No, I think it's a very exciting time, and increasing the reach of transportation options to connect people with opportunities and make them safer and more walkable and more accessible is, it's a great goal, and it's great to be at a conference where we are discussing the big issues of the day. And so, thanks to the Micromobility Conference and to you for this conversation.